So let's talk a little more about the current and the flood. First of all, you know, there's a saying about water. Anybody know anything about rebuilding New Orleans? What happened after the flood there? Anybody know anything about floods? Like the Army Corps of Engineers goes in and it stops water from going where it wants to go. Max, what's your thought about that? How difficult that is? How crazy that is?
It's incredibly difficult, and the water broke the dike to begin with, and so it's temporary. It's a temporary solution. It's only a matter of time before whatever the solution is, whatever they have to contain the current, the flood, is ruptures again.
So the natural state of things is that water will go where it goes. It
Yes.
finds its own level. Anna, your thought on this?
No, I mean, I agree with Max. It's sort of like a doomed project, like from the beginning, to try and like stop water from where it wants to go. It's kind of
so analogously, yes. So the Army Corps of Engineers, anybody who builds a dam or a dike, is essentially holding off something that is probably the most powerful thing that we know in nature. It will take all artificial human structures and eventually find its way to destroy it or defy it. Okay, analogously, what's Emily saying about thinking?
that your brain's going to go where it wants to go.
The brain cannot be stopped. It cannot be stopped. So constraint is the equivalent of the artifice of the dam or the dike or the rerouting of a river. So now let's look at this comparison. But let a splinter swerve. 'Twere easier for you to stop the water in a flood. Easier than what?
Than to remain true to the course that you began on.
Okay, so it would be easier, so it's pretty damned hard. It's easier to put the flood back after Katrina than it is to stop your brain from thinking the thoughts, the B, after you're supposed to be thinking of A. Easier to go somewhere else. Is she advocating that we let the brain go somewhere else? And if so, how? Tough question.
I think so, in the context of our last poem, if we're talking about possibility, we should let the brain go wild.
So she's advocating that wildness. Is there any evidence in the rhetoric, vocabulary, structure, form?
I think the but is extremely important because that is the moment where the initial image that she sets up is interrupted. So in a way, the but kind of acts as the splinter in the poem.
So the brain within its groove goes down evenly and true, but just think of something else. You will abandon your metaphor, and it will be easier to retreat from that abandonment and go back to where you were. It would be actually easier to do that than it would be to put a current of a flood back to where it was after it had slit the hills, a reference to just naturally or actually speaking, slitting hills.
So a flash flood or a canyon.
Canyons, flash floods, arroyos. These are places where the water will go when the flood takes place, and the hills have been slit and scooped a turnpike for themselves. I guess another reference to that turnpike would be, Anna?
276.
You were thinking of highways. Yeah. I mean, turnpike here refers to a kind of groove, except that it's made by the flood, a turnpike for themselves, and trodden out the mills. Trodden. Who's got trodden? I think somebody
I
had.
do.
Amaris,
Yes.
tell us about trodden.
It seems to evoke a sort of weariness or reluctance, but in this case, since it's bringing out the mills, that's the way to yield positive.
Well, just give me a synonym for trodden. It's an unusual word. It probably is a word related to trod.
Unusual use in this context, though.
What's that?
It kind of has an unusual use in this context.
Yeah, well, what does it mean? Somebody provide a synonym. Dave?
Stamped out.
Stamped out. Stomped on. Trodden. Trodden out is the neologism here. The invented thing is the idiom trodden out. I'm not sure that anybody's ever used that until now. Trodden out. And So, are you ready, Max, for mills?
mills?
Yeah, tell us about mills.
Well, a mill here, a mill that would be sit along a river or a creek, would harness the energy of the water or of the current.
Oh, so a mill produces power from
Produces
nature.
power to make flour or various.
Other than a mill that derives its power from water, is there another kind of mill?
A windmill.
A windmill.
Absolutely.
So this is not a windmill. This is New England of the 19th century, where mills are a primary economic structure. And where do you put mills? You started to say this.
Along a river or a creek or a body of water or the current. Because it harnesses the energy.
How?
By letting the current turn the wheel.
Current turns a wheel turns another wheel, and what happens is you grind grain, or you produce some kind of energy. This is prior to electricity. So you need mills to manufacture. You need mills to be economically what New England is or was.
Yes.
Okay, but now the mills have been trodden out. So what's the state of things? The mills are gone.
Maybe new ones have to be constructed now that this turnpike exists on another...
Sure, we always rebuild. We rebuild New Orleans, arguably, the way it was, even though probably we should never have built it there in the first place, because there's inevitably going to be not only floods, but second thoughts, if I can put it that way, according to this poem. But anyway, so the entire basis, the entire structure, the entire business plan and concept for New England has been trodden out, and we're going to rebuild the mills. Except where are we going to put them? This is so profound. Where are we going to put them? Anna? Molly?
By the new Turnpike?
Yeah, the only way you can do it is to move the mill to where the floods are now, where the water moves now. Do you think that Emily Dickinson is skeptical about this? What?
I'm positive maybe in that skepticism, because it's inevitable that another Splinter will come, but that seems to reference that idea of
she's
park.
okay with that. I think she's okay with that.
Yeah.
She's okay with this destruction. It's the destruction of a system that was based on the notion that you could build something permanent next to something permanent and expect them to stay where it is. But what's changing is the way the mind works.
Well, if you want to get even more like meta-poetic with it,
We could do that.
If we can go there, I mean, if she's talking about the destruction of a system or destruction of form, you can think about the way that she's actually constructed this poem, which is in 2 4-line stanzas. The rhyme is A, B, C, B in both stanzas. But she's messing with it because she's got these dashes and she's got these capitalizations. So the form is there, and if you take away the dashes and take away the capitalizations, it's actually relatively, I mean, if you don't think about what it means, it's relatively traditional. But she's inserted these capitalizations, these dashes, and she's really messing with, she's kind of destroying the form that so many people in her time would still have used.
And if you were to diagram the structure of the metaphors here, of the conceits, they would go off the end. They never circle back. They never form a completion. In fact, but, as Al has been saying, sends the whole poem off the side. And then the comparison that it would be easier for you to do all the rest of this, to train the floods that slit the hills, scooped the turnpike for themselves, and knocked out the whole economic structure of my native land. What would be more powerful than that, if this is only a comparison, what would be more powerful than that is, or more difficult, is to try to put the brain back to thinking the way it used to think. This is about unconventional thinking. This is about being open to something unpredictable.
And poets aren't going to think the same way after her and Walt.
Wow, you're really being meta-poetic in thinking about this poem as predictive of the kind of influence. She's unleashing a flood, and it's the flood of a mind that goes where it wants to go, and of a poem that allows itself to go where the form is going to take it, even if it violates conventions of conceits, of consistent conceits. It's going to go anywhere that it wants to. This is about letting the mind go where it wants to, within a form. All right, so let's think together a little bit about the implications of this. This is very powerful. Amaris, your thought on this? I'm obviously excited about this and think it's very powerful. Do you agree?
Yes, I think it embodies that paradoxical idea of dazzling gradually that we talked about in the previous poem. We sort of just have this idea of partial truths in succession, and it's up to the reader to find this new turnpike for him or herself. And that's my general takeaway.
Good. Any other thoughts on this? Why do you like this, Dave?
I think she's saying be open to new ideas, always be submissive to new ideas and let them take you where they may. If you try to ignore it, it might do damage to that idea.
Max?
And yet there's, I think, as Anna was suggesting, there's still some structure that remains. It's still a house of possibility, one that's built, that has rooms, even though it's an expansive one. It's still contained.
It's the
There's still
Borgesian one.
you
It's
can-
an impossible one. It's impossible, but it's about possibility. It's very hard to conceive of the actuality of these conceits all added together, particularly here. I see a train slowly swerving off its tracks. The tracks disappear. Now we have a flood. We've got a new direction, a new A to B, and then we've destroyed the in-the-box thinking that allowed us to harness power. This is like a classic Dickinsonian notion that the most powerful thing we have is the brain. It's more powerful even than water. Much later in the course, in chapter 2, we're going to be looking at a Tender Buttons poem by Gertrude Stein, which is about water. And she plays with the same kind of unpredictability of water, and water becomes a metaphor for improvisation. You know, I teach this poem to business people. And it takes a long time, it takes about 50 minutes, and we get to the end, and what they say in their terms is, this is about out-of-the-box thinking. This is, one of them said recently, this is about how in 1960 the railroads were doomed because they thought they were in the railroad business when in fact they're in the transportation business. That's a cliche about business plans, about thinking about where you put your mills. And if you put your mills thinking that mills always have to be by water, then you're going to be out of business when the floods come. What Emily is saying is that out-of-the-box thinking requires a form that allows the brain to go where it's going to go and to unleash the power of the brain. And there is no equivalent to the mill. The mill would have to be the traditional poem, the form of the traditional poem that gets run over by the brain. So she's pre-modern or proto-modern in the sense that she's working with this stanza and she's pushing as hard as she can at the edges of it and exploding the notion of consistent conceit and allowing her to do what she wants right at the edge of destroying the whole thing. So when we get to modernism in chapter 2 of the course, the modernists want to make it new. They want to blow it all up. They want to start again. They don't want to touch the sonnet. They want to get out of the traditional form business. This seems to be, in a way, the genesis of all of that.
Pretty Whitmanian.
You had to get a Whitmanian final word.
I did.
Good. Good for you.